Hello and welcome to the second episode of this series. And it took a couple months. I apologize for that, but that's because I wanted to make a well-researched video that was a bit longer and involved a bit more locations. So the second episode is about Berend Velsink, who lived from 1802 to 1851, and this story starts in the Dutch town of Zwolle in the province of Overijssel, and on the 31st of January 1802, Berend was born into the family of Hendrik Velsink and Jantje Harms Doosjen. His father worked for the local tax office and later on moved to become an administrator for the customs office in Frieseveen, which is also in the province of Overijssel. Berend was the eldest child in this family, which means that he was followed by his sister Geertruida, a sister Cornelia, a brother Hendrik Jan, a sister Hendrika, another sister called Petronella Susanna, a brother Herman, and a stillborn child. Now his brother Herman only lived a couple of months, and given that Berend was already 17 at the time, he was at least mature enough to realize the loss of his younger sibling. This story truly becomes colonial when Berend leaves Zwolle and moves to the town of Harderwijk in the province of Gelderland. Now, why does he move to Harderwijk? Harderwijk had a registration office for the colonial army, and that's what he went to do. He went to Harderwijk, and on the 21st of April 1820, he signed a contract for 6 years to serve in the Netherlands Indies Army. He starts off as a jager, which means hunter, but I don't know the English equivalent. But a few months later, on the 23rd of June 1820, he gets promoted to corporal. He goes off to the Dutch East Indies. The Suez Canal wasn't there yet, so they had to sail around Africa. And he arrived there on the 27th of December. He only served in a military position for 10 months and 5 days, which is nowhere close to 6 years. How he did it, I don't know. But it's clear that on the 1st of November 1821, he was first clerk for the office of the Colonial Navy, which means that he sort of transitioned from military service into civil service. He only did so on the 1st of May 1823, when he became the commis, which doesn't truly have an English translation, so for the rest of the video I'm just going to say administrator. It's basically like a clerk, but a bit higher up. So he becomes a second administrator for the office of the ingoing and outgoing rights in Batavia, or the customs office in Batavia. Now, two major things happen in 1825. The first thing, or at least the most close to him, is that in that year his only remaining brother Hendrik Jan dies in Ulm at the age of 13. The second thing that happened in 1825 was the Java War started. He was in Batavia at the time, so he received news of the war, but he wasn't in the most danger at the time. He's also very lucky that he switched from military into civil service, because you can imagine, had he been in the army at the time of the war, he most likely would have been killed. Although the casualties on the side of Prince Diponegoro was way higher than on the European side, if you could say. In 1826, he was honorably discharged and was appointed first administrator, second class, for the customs office in Batavia still. It's only in 1827 he gets appointed to administrator receiver, and receiver also has to do with the customs agency, but this time in the town of Semarang. Now Semarang is in the center of the northern coast of Java, and basically you have three customs offices that did all the major foreign shipping. So that's Batavia, that's Semarang, that's Surabaya. So he made promotion and was sent to the second office in Semarang. Now, he basically did the same work as in Batavia, where he basically did work at the customs office there in the town of Semarang. He married on the 29th of April 1829 at the age of 27 to 20-year-old Magdalena Raquet, or Raquet, I don't know if it's French origin or not. Magdalena was probably the daughter of Matthäus Petrus Raquet and Elisabeth Johanna Mooijaard. This marriage, however, resulted in one child, but it wasn't a happy ending to this marriage because Magdalena died on the 9th of April 1830. So they hadn't been married for almost a year, and the only child that they had together, which I suspect was called Magdalena, but it's a bit complicated, died several days later and was then buried with Magdalena in the same coffin, or at least according to Berend's announcements in the newspaper. Now, a few years later, in 1834, he moved to Surabaya, and he basically did work for the customs office again. What he did then as well, although he lived in Surabaya, he married in Semarang on the 7th of May 1834 at the age of 32 to 17-year-old Charlotte Adelaide Dupois de la Saussaye, and she was born in Colombo, which was on Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, as the daughter of a magistrate called Jean-Guillaume Dupois de la Saussaye and Johanna Anna Susanna van Linde. Now, how these two met is a bit unclear, but my theory is that since Charlotte had a sister called Stephanie, who was married to a guy with the last name Raquet, I suspect that Berend got to know Charlotte via his ex-brother-in-law. Of course, I can't prove that, but given how small the European community was in the Indies, it is very likely. They had several children together, of which 7 were born in the Indies, and the first one was a son called Bernardus Charles Velsink, who was born in 1835. That same year, tragedy struck as the mother of Berend died on the 22nd of June 1835 at the age of 55 in Deventer. The year after that, they had a daughter called Magdalena Johanna Everdina. Then the year after that, they had a son called James Henry. Then they had a daughter again called Johanna Hendrika Susanna. 2 years after that, they had another daughter called Adelaida Maria Elisabeth. Then 2 years after that, they had another daughter called Charlotte Bernardina Ottelina. And 2 years after that, they had their final daughter called Wilhelmina Henriette Mathilde. Technically, they also had another child living with them, a girl called Bia, but her story is a bit more complicated, and I think I'm gonna use it for a different video. But keep in mind that with these children, Bia was also living within this family. Now, from 1834 to 1842, Berend worked at the commission's office in Surabaya, and it basically seems to be that he was in charge of a portion of the customs office. I don't understand why they did it, but in June of 1842 they appointed him the resident of Banda. Now, what this means, the resident is basically the leader of a certain province, a residency it's called, in the Dutch East Indies, which means that he represents the European authority and he is basically in charge of the area. Of course, he has to collaborate with native officials, but he is the highest authority in the place that he works. Now, of course, before Berend worked at the customs office, so it's a bit of a weird step to be in charge of maybe the harbor and goods that go in and out, to being in charge of people as well. Of course, for him, I understand why he got that rank, because it's a higher office, it gets paid more, and of course, it's a step up from being a civil servant at the customs office. However, he does get involved with a few scandals that would stain his reputation, take away his potential at getting an even higher office. So the first scandal happens in 1843 when a British ship called Alcmena, under Captain William McKellar Galbraith, strands at the coast of Ceram, which is an island close to Banda, on the 27th of January 1843. Now, most of the trouble from this stranding of the ship doesn't involve Berend that much, because the whole first problem that arises is that these British subjects need to go back to Britain. So a few of the residents and governors of the local authorities take care of these soldiers and then ship them back to England. But the problem was that they tried to get the British to pay for all this, but people kept saying that they weren't the ones in charge. So one company owned the ship, the other belonged with the captain, and nobody wanted to be responsible and pay for it. So what they did was the cargo of the ship, which was amphoon, which is a raw form of opium, and what Berend then decided to do was to auction off the opium, which he did, and they received 34,392 guilders for it, which he then put in the cash register, or like the colonial register. However, because of the cargo not being by the same owners of the ship, Berend wasn't allowed to even auction off the opium. So as a result, they had to give the 43,000 guilders to the company that owned the opium. And the Dutch colonial government was also mad because they said that Velsink acted as a private person and not as the resident. The resident wasn't allowed to just hold auction and sell off these things of the ship. So they get pretty mad about it, and Governor General Reinst writes a letter basically asking the English if they can please pay for like the damages and the upkeep of the sailors and stuff, and for the journey back home. Then in 1843, so the same year, two other scandals happen. The first case involves somebody who was sentenced to death, but they escaped. His name was Bachoak. He fled. The problem was that Berend had sounded the alarm, but he didn't inform anyone of like what was even truly going on. So it wasn't very helpful. And then the second thing that happened was there was a fight between civilians between the villages of Celemon and Kampong Baru on the island of Banda, and basically some armed military men went there and used their guns, which resulted in the death of one person. And the Governor General then decided, well, there needs to be some collaboration between military service and civil service, because you can't just go out and shoot someone without the authority of the resident, and as the resident you can't just sound the alarm without involving the military. So this was all sent back to Den Haag, and then the year after that another big scandal happened, which involved another British ship. The Royalist was the name of the ship, and the captain was Gerald Kingsley. What went down was that Kingsley had been invited to a party on Banda, and that party happened because the school exams were finished or similar, and he was invited to a party. Now he had heard that British officers were not allowed to be at the party, so he then asked some Dutch military officers if that was the case or not. They said, I don't know, just go to the party, we'll see. And then at the party, some English officers tried to enter the party but were not allowed in. Then Berend got involved and grabbed an officer by the arm and said, like, either you go now or I'm gonna put you somewhere safe. And somewhere safe, they meant the prison. And so the English officers were very offended and left. Then Velsink signaled the Dutch officers to please join the party, but they refused out of solidarity with the English officers. Then later on, Kingsley had heard people say that he had apologized to Velsink, which was not the case. So he went to Velsink again to ask, I have heard that I apologize, but do you mean that you're gonna apologize? And then Velsink was like, no, I am not. The other officer apologized. And then the officer said no. And then Velsink called him a liar, which also made things worse. So they both left. Then Kingsley was on a ship, I guess, and he received a letter from Velsink saying that some drunk British officers had gotten into the Chinese camp, and another Englishman had tried to enter like the inlands of the island. And then Velsink said, like, if you don't have any business on Banda again, please leave, and leave at least within the next 2 days. Kingsley then wrote back saying, I can discipline my sailors, but I'm not gonna leave over it. And then Velsink said, well, I never said that you had to leave. And then Kingsley was like, what? But you literally did. And so that's basically this scandal. Kingsley wrote to the Governor General, who wrote to the Ministry of Colonies, which basically said that they had to find the Royalist again, which was close to New South Wales on Australia, and tell them that this wasn't a planned thing. And they sort of apologized for it, like they made clear that what Berend did wasn't what was supposed to happen. And they asked someone to sort of investigate it further, but it never really led anywhere except for like the sort of apology. Then the other scandals are short, but they're weird as well. So in 1844/1845, Velsink gives like there's a guy who supplies rice to the island who was called J.W. Nijs. And he was like, yeah, you can have an advance of 20,220 guilders. Like, you can have it now and we'll see what happens. And then he received, like, back payment of 1,000 guilders. And the Dutch government was like, well, Velsink did not have any rights to give an advance of 20,000 guilders. So there was like an oops. Then some other stuff happened in 1845, which were kind of weird. First thing, there was a guy who owned some farm, sort of, on Banda. His name was A. Herrebrug, and he was an appraiser, and he had done that for quite some time, and everybody was happy with him. But still, he got fired by Velsink, and he was mad about it. And then he suddenly says, like, also, by the way, Velsink has dishonored my daughter. And then the Governor General just says, like, well, in this case, just he insulted your daughter as a private person and not from his function as resident, so you should go to civil court about that. And then also, Velsink had a conflict with C.J. de Charon de Saint-Germain. I don't know what he did, I don't know what the issue is, but they were pretty mad about it. So they asked the governor of the Moluccas, because Banda was a residency, but there was also a governor above it. And they asked him for his judgment, and I think they never received that one as well. All these scandals lead to the point where they fire Velsink as the resident of Banda. And they even say, like, because of shortcomings. Like, he was so bad at the job that they were like, we're gonna fire you for now. Not dishonorably. He wasn't no longer in that specific function, but he was still on the payroll of the colonial government. So they put him on 1/3 of his normal salary, which he got for just being unemployed. And then he surrenders Banda to the next guy, which is V.L. van Guurike, which implies that Velsink left Banda around June of 1846. And in December of that year, they say, well, you don't have to pay the tax that you would pay if you were the resident of Banda. I don't know exactly what tax this is, but it will come into play later. And in September of 1847, he gets a 2-year leave due to sickness. I don't have a copy of this document, so I don't know what sickness it is, but at least it was severe enough to be on foreign leave for 2 years. So he takes his family and moves back to the Netherlands. First he moves to Hasselt, then moves his family to Zwolle, and he just stays there. Now what then happens is he wants to be on leave for a longer period, and in 1849 he writes a letter about that to the Ministry of Colonies. Now what the deal was that Berend, his wife, was pregnant, and he said, well, I want to see the birth of my child, but I'm gonna leave around the time that the child is gonna be born, and I don't want to miss that. So can I get 3 months extra? And so he sends a letter to Den Haag, to the Minister of Colonies, which name was Bout. And together with that letter is a different letter, which was great. It was a letter by his old employer, old governor of the Moluccas, who was called De Serrière. And that letter says originally that he wanted a year of extra leave because of financial problems. And then De Serrière says that, I've always cared about Velsink's family, his numerous, but given that he did not get a year leave extra, the letter probably didn't mean that much. But what is interesting is that Velsink's own letter seems to have worked. And in that letter he says that he doesn't have to explain anything further because of your excellency being a husband and a father. And they're like, okay, yeah, I guess. And that son is Willem Frederik Velsink, who indeed gets born in Zwolle, because he does get the extra leave. And the interesting stuff in this letter is that he says that he wants to leave his wife and kids in the Netherlands so she can focus on raising them and educating them. But he also wants to leave some money behind so can he get some advancement on his leave payment. Now he does, and indeed he leaves his family in Zwolle, goes by himself all the way back to Batavia, where he arrives around 1849. Now he lives there for a few years, and he doesn't get appointed into any new function or any new job. They just have him there, and then they give him a bunch of stuff saying that, well, you received too much travel expenses, or like you had too many travel expenses and you received too much money for that, so we want you to pay it all back. And this comes down to a few thousand guilders, which is a lot. And basically the last year or so he gets told that he needs to pay that back. And then he officially gets honorably discharged on the 8th of July 1851. And then in October, on the 9th of that year, he just dies at the age of 49 in Batavia with nobody around, because his wife and kids are still in Zwolle, and he dies and he leaves all the debt that he has with the colonial government to his wife, and that's the end of the story. That's the end of Berend Velsink. So yeah, I here is a list of all the people I've mentioned and all the sources I've used, and I hope you enjoyed my rambling, I guess. It's just such a funny and interesting and also sort of tragic story. And yeah, thank you for watching, and the next ones are probably going to be shorter but still well researched. So thank you for watching, and till next time. Doei.